It's time for us to get started with our last class. You remember last week we got to Acts 21 at about verse 36, 37, the end of chapter 21, beginning into 22. You remember the setup of the book has been Paul and his missionary trips. He has finished his third missionary trip. He has come into Jerusalem with the warning from Agabus and other prophets that once he goes into Jerusalem, this will be his final time to go to Jerusalem, or it will be the time that he's going to be bound and arrested, and he's going to be carried out. And you remember Acts 21, he comes into the temple after the elders at the church at Jerusalem have asked him to pay for the vows of the 7 men they have taking that Nazirite vow. And he went into the temple, and remember, some Jews from Asia saw him and accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple. But you remember, Paul says, he did no such thing. But because it's such a serious offense, they carry him out. Again, assuming they carried him out of the temple to stone him. And as they carry him out of the temple, this is where the Roman guards will step in, and this is where we're at. And so, again, this is that model of the temple complex. So again, what the accusation is that Paul has brought Gentiles into this section. Now, again, as far as the temple complex, this is the court of women. This is the court of men, the court of Israel. This is where the altar would be for the sacrificing the golden laver, and this will be the temple itself. And so it's in this area that they begin to drag Paul out, and then the guards, you remember, are positioned in this right here. This is the barracks that Herod had built to house the Roman soldiers. And so it's somewhere in this complex that we see this scene unfold. And so the Jews have dragged Paul away, and as they're dragging Paul away, the soldiers step in, and this is where we get into verse 37, as Paul is being brought into the barracks. So he's being brought into this complex over here. He speaks to the tribunal, and when he speaks to them, he asks to speak to the crowd. Because if you notice, the tribunal starts off by asking in verse 38, are you an Egyptian? There's an Egyptian who had just recently caused a revolt. The historian Josephus tells us about an Egyptian who causes a revolt about this time. And so that's where history lines up with Acts, an outside source. And so Paul says, no, I'm a Jew from Tarsus. He says that I ask you to let me speak. And it's very interesting. If you go to verse 37, the tribunal asks him, do you speak Greek? And Paul begins to speak to him in Greek. But then when he speaks to the people in verse 40, he begins to speak in Hebrew. This would have been the language of the religion, if you will. And so he begins to tell the Hebrews, the Jews there, his defense, and he begins to tell them about what he's going to do. And notice he speaks to them. Verse 2, they hear him speaking in Hebrew, and they become even more quiet. Now, where this is even more important is this shows Paul's learning in that he's able to fluently speak Hebrew. There is a question of how many Jews actually could understand Hebrew. There's probably a good part of them, but a lot think from the history records that the common man may not have known Hebrew as well as others. And so this would give even more weight to Paul, that he stands and he begins to defend himself. You know, verse 3, he begins by telling his history and his background, how he talks about he's from Tarsus in Cilicia. And notice he says he was brought up in this city educated at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, we've talked about Gamaliel from Acts 5. And he says, according to the strict manner of the law of your fathers. You notice, being zealous for God as all of you are this day. So he begins to elaborate his history, telling them that he is just like them and that he is zealous for God and zealous for his word. You notice verse 5, he begins, or verse 4, he begins to talk about persecuting the way and of what he does. And so what we have here in Acts 20, or 21 is the, 22, I'll get it right in a minute. This is Paul, this is the second of 3 times he'll tell his conversion story. Or his conversion story is told. It's told first in Acts 9, then Acts 22, and then we're going to see Acts 24 and 25. He's going to tell it again. And so he begins to tell them about what happens to him. Now, some will say here, and they'll look at this, and they'll try to find some contradictions in that. In verse 6, Paul begins to tell a story about the light and what it says to him. In verse 9, it says, those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice or hear the voice of the one who is speaking to me. Some will find a contradiction in that, because if you look back in chapter 9, when we're told this story the first time, there's the reference, let's see if I can get here. Chapter 9, verse 7, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. And so some will look at this and say, oh, well, Luke got the story mixed up. Luke says there that they heard the voice, but didn't see anybody. Here, Paul says they saw the light, they heard the voice. But again, they didn't see anybody. The way you reconcile this is this way. Chapter 9 says they heard the voice, but it doesn't mean they understood the voice. And that's why some translations here will have, they heard but did not understand. Meaning they could hear something speaking, but they didn't know what it was saying to Paul, because this was a direct revelation of Paul. Now, again, how was it speaking? What language? We don't know. But apparently only Paul could hear the message of Jesus as he spoke to him. And so Paul begins to retell that he heard this voice. This voice told him what to do. It speaks to him of what he's going to have to go to Damascus. And again, remember, he says you're told what you're going to do. Verse 12, he tells us about Ananias. That Ananias was there. And Ananias comes to him after, again, he skips the part of Ananias having been persuaded to come see him. But in verse 14 to 16, he lays out more of what Ananias says to him. Again, notice when we look at Acts 9, there's really not a whole lot that Ananias does. Ananias comes in, he talks to Paul for just a second, and Paul's baptized. Well, we find out in chapter 22, Ananias speaks a little more to Paul than what's recorded in Acts 9, and the reason for that being is because Luke is going to reveal this to us in these 3 passages. He's not going to tell us all at one time. And so if you look at verses 14 through 16 of Acts 22, it says, and he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to every one of what you have seen and heard. Then verse 16, and now do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. Now again, notice this very interesting verse of verse 16, where Ananias equates the idea of being baptized with washing your sins away with calling on his name. He equates those actions as equal. That being baptized is equal, the same as calling on the name of the Lord. Now some will argue and say, well, they'll come up with their ideas of what calling on the name of the Lord is, but Acts 22:16 is a hard verse for them to overcome and describe something other than what Paul says. And Paul is told to rise and be baptized, calling on the name of the Lord. And then we read from back chapter 9 that after that he did those very things. And so what we see is here Paul tells his conversion story, and then Paul continues to speak in verse 17 about what he's doing. Notice, then when he had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me," again, it's talking about Jesus, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving, watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So here we have, again, further revelation of when Paul goes into Jerusalem. You remember Paul, after he leaves Damascus after 3 years, he come to Jerusalem in Acts 9. Barnabas brings him into the church and to the church to believe in him. As he's there, he gets into arguments with the Jews, and the Jews send him out. The Jews send him away into, they send him back to Tarsus, the church sends him to Tarsus to get away from the Jews, to prevent them from causing him, from imprisoning and killing him, basically. And here Paul says that while he was there, he had a vision, a trance, where Jesus spoke these things to him and told him to get away. And you notice he says, "I know what I did, they know what I've done, and now they've seen this change." Then notice 21, Paul will emphasize his mission. And his mission was that he was to be sent to the Gentiles. Now, as soon as he says this, verse 22, notice, up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." So the Jews are listening. They were intrigued by what he says and listening to what his truth is, until he talks about the Gentiles becoming a part of the church and being sent to the Gentiles. And again, remember, he is under arrest because he brought a Gentile into the temple. And so this is where the crowd turns on him. And again, notice they begin to come after him. If you read this section, they begin to come after Paul. Verse 23, verse 24, the tribunal orders him to be brought into the barracks. And you'll notice that the tribunal is preparing to examine him by flogging. The idea is that they're going to beat him. You know the old saying we say, they're going to beat the truth out of him. That's what they're going to do. They're going to beat him till he tells them what's going on, till he can explain the situation. And you notice, again, interesting thing happens, verse 25. The tribunal brings Paul out. He's ready to question him. He's got him strapped down to be beaten. Again, the idea when they stretched him out for the whips. Paul said to the centurion standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" Now, again, the idea of stretched out is there's different ways they would have done this. They would have had either two poles upright where they'd have stretched his arms out and exposed his back, or there's some who, and again, depending on where you were and who the Romans were and what they felt like, they would have something almost like a barrel or a table to stretch you over, to expose your back. They did this to cause the most pain possible. They would tie you down where you couldn't move, you couldn't flinch, and the most of your back was exposed so they could easily beat them. And so this is where Paul gets. Now, you'll notice something we've hinted at a few times, and I don't know if I've actually dug into this yet, with the idea of a Roman citizen. I think we mentioned this in previous classes, but here's where it comes into play again, where Paul uses his Roman citizen, says, "Is this right for you to be a Roman citizen?" Again, Roman law was this. If you were a Roman citizen, you had rights no one else did. And here's how this works. If you weren't a Roman citizen, you could be beat, arrested, executed with no trial, nothing. They could just do what they wanted to do with you. It was just, they had their full reign. If you were a Roman citizen, it's sort of like us. You had to have a reason why you were being arrested. You had to have a reason for why you were being beaten. You had to have a case to prove yourself. That's why Paul says you beat a Roman citizen uncondemned. And what would happen is if a soldier or soldiers beat a Roman citizen who is uncondemned, they would be guilty and they would have a penalty. They would either be beaten themselves or possibly even executed. And in the case here of the tribunal, he would have lost his, or the tribune, he would have lost his position. He would have lost his authority. So this is why it's such a big deal when Paul says, are you supposed to be a Roman citizen uncondemned? And then you notice verse 26, when they hear this, they all sort of back off. They all back off and say, hey, this guy's a Roman citizen. Now, this is what's interesting about it, is because what makes Paul different from the rest of the Jews is very few Jews were actually Roman citizens. The Jews were a people that viewed themselves as God's people, God's kingdom, and therefore they rejected any earthly king. And so the Jews constantly fought and constantly argued with the Roman Empire, and they, in most cases, refused to be Roman citizens because that meant you were subject to Caesar. And so for Paul to be a Roman citizen and be a Jew was an oddity, and that's why the tribune never asked him, are you a citizen? Can you prove your citizenship? Any of those questions. And we get a little hint into this Roman citizenship in verse 27 and following, verse 27 through 29. So the tribune came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? He said, yes. The tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. So again, notice that what he does here is the tribune realizes that even to arrest Paul the way he did is now illegal. Now, you'll notice what Paul says about his Roman citizenship in talking to this soldier. There were three ways, and I think we talked about this before, three ways you became a Roman citizen. You were either born in a Roman province, you bought your Roman citizenship, or you served in the military for a certain number of years and you became a Roman citizen afterward if you survived. That was sort of the reward. And the idea there is that if you were a soldier and you went to war and you fought for Rome and you came home alive, then the least Rome could do was make you a citizen. And so this is sort of the bottom, and here's the other thing about the Roman citizens, is depending on how you got your citizenship is how the Romans viewed you. To be a soldier to get the Roman citizen, you were a low-level Roman citizen. You got it because you offered your life. The second level above the bottom is the idea you bought it. And this is what the tribunal says. The tribune says, I paid a large sum. You could go to Roman councils and they would tell you, okay, you pay me so much money and we'll make you a Roman citizen. And it was official. And so this was not a cheap process to become a Roman citizen. And that was sort of the mid-level Roman citizen. Now, the elite Roman citizen were those who were born a Roman. And that's why when we see Paul here, when he says, I was born a citizen, the tribune seems to even take a further step back to say, okay, we've got to make sure we cross every T and dot every I here because he is a natural born Roman. He's not one who is made a Roman by somebody else. And so that's why he starts to back up, and that's where we begin to see this next part. This is going to play, this sets up the rest of the book of Acts, and that this is why Paul is given such leeway. Paul is never really bound in a prison, and like we read in Acts 12 and Acts 16, being an innermost part with guards around him, no freedom. This is why he's placed under house arrest in so many places, is because there's no real charge in the government system, and he's a Roman citizen, and therefore they have to be very careful. Again, it's about like the closest parallel we could have today. It would be about like, say that somebody was arrested because, say we wanted somebody arrested because they were a member of another type of church. They were a Catholic, and we want to arrest them for that. The U.S. law has no problem with that. But our system is designed where we don't arrest for those places. Rome was a corrupt system. And Rome wanted to keep people happy, and if you paid money, you didn't fight, they would do what they could for you. So this is why Paul is arrested. It's arrested on a religious issue, and he's kept to keep the Jews happy. However, as far as Roman law is concerned, Paul's done nothing wrong, and that's going to actually, again, play a part later on in what happens with Paul. And so from there, we get to the end of chapter 22, beginning into chapter 23. In chapter 23, Paul is going to stand and defend himself. The next day, the tribune calls the Jews into place, and he wants them to tell about what has happened. He brings Paul out again, chapter 23, and Paul begins to speak again. Again, notice Paul starts out, and we have a very interesting thing that happens here. Paul starts out in verse 1 saying that I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Notice, Paul says, I've done everything that I'm supposed to have done. I have obeyed God in all things. I've been faithful to God in all things. And in saying this, verse 2, the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And again, when Paul asks, verse 3, why are you, he actually calls them out and says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting in to judge me according to law, and yet contrary to law you make an order to strike me? Verse 4, those who stood by, would you revile God's high priest? Verse 5, Paul says, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So what happens here is Paul cries out and says that he's lived the right life, and to the Jews, this is blasphemy. They are going to say, because he's teaching the Christian way, because he's teaching Gentiles and converting Gentiles, therefore he has turned his back on the Jews, and therefore they're going to go after him, and this is why they have him struck, because of his statement. And then you notice Paul cries out and says, why'd you do it? And it's interesting that Paul cries out, and you see Paul's response to them in that he says, you whitewashed walls. The idea of a whitewashed wall is the whitewashed wall of a tomb. GS will call them the same thing, is the idea of, even today we do this, if you go to certain cemeteries, they'll clean the tombstones up and make them look good. Paul's saying that's what these people are. It's great to clean the tombstone up, but what's behind this tombstone or under the tombstone? It's nothing but your dead bodies. And that's what he's calling them. He says, you're nothing but the outside, you look right, but inside you're full of dead bodies, and you're just a whitewashed wall. You're just the outward looking right, but inward you're not. And then they who call out to him say, well, you're speaking against the high priest. And Paul says, I didn't know he was the high priest. Now, the reason for this would be, is we haven't touched this much, but during the Roman occupation, I think we may have mentioned this, the Romans didn't allow a governor or a political figure to stay in power very long. God's law was that when you became a high priest, you were a high priest till you died. Romans came in and they put a limit on the high priest. We don't know how many years or how long the term he could serve, but this is why you read about Ananias and Caiaphas in the trial of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We've read it earlier in the book of Acts. There were two high priests. Well, this is why. One is the official Jewish high priest, but his time has passed, and the Romans have designated his son to be the high priest, but the Jews still treat the father as the high priest because according to God's law, he is the high priest. And so here Paul is saying, I didn't realize this was a high priest, and he seems to put them off guard by his respect for the high priest when he quotes the law to them. He quotes their teaching, and so he seems to put them into a fear or put them offset of what they're going to do. Now, beginning in verse 6, we see Paul beginning to maneuver his way forward. It's very interesting how Paul addresses this issue. You notice verse 6. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. It is with respect to the hope and resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Now, here's what's interesting about what Paul does here, if you don't know this distinction. In the Jewish hierarchy, the Jewish high teachings, there were two major sects, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the strict keepers of the law. They were the ones who designated different laws and had the laws detailed out verbatim, Sabbath day journey, a Sabbath load, that kind. They were very peculiar in keeping the law. The Sadducees, and if we put it in today's terminology, the Pharisees were the right, and the Sadducees were the left. You know, politically and leaning conservative and liberal. The Pharisees were considered conservative. The Sadducees were liberal. There were three major things about the Pharisees. They refused the idea that there were angels. They refused the idea that there was a life beyond this one, and they refused the idea that there was a resurrection of the dead. I'm trying to think, I may have missed one. But those are two big things. They didn't believe in angels, and then they didn't believe there was a resurrection of the dead. And Paul realizes this. Paul stands up here, and if you notice what Paul does, it would almost be about like today being called in front of Congress or Senate or the House of Representatives, whatever you want to be in front of, and getting up there defending yourself, and one of the first things you say is, well, I'm only here because I'm a Republican, or I'm only here because I'm a Democrat. And when you say that word, the first thing that's going to happen is what? All the Republicans, if you say I'm a Republican, oh, well, he's a good guy if he's on our side. Or a Democrat, he's a good guy because he's on our side. That's what Paul does. He takes his counsel and he divides them by what they teach. And you notice he says, I'm here because I'm a Pharisee. And then notice the second thing he says is because of the hope and the resurrection of the dead. This was a major issue of contention. The Pharisees and Sadducees constantly argued about whether or not there was a resurrection of the dead. And this even comes in the life of Jesus. This offshoot. If you remember the Sadducees, you remember the one they come and ask Jesus about the woman who married 7 brothers, and they say, after this life in heaven, whose wife will she be? Those are Sadducees who asked him that question. They didn't even believe that there was going to be a resurrection, that there would be a life after this one. So they were trying to set Jesus up in that question. And so this is what Paul does. And Jesus maneuvers that question in a very similar way that Paul does here. And that Paul tries to divide them and say, well, we're Sadducees and Pharisees. It's because I'm a Pharisee that I'm here. And it's because of the resurrection, because of what I teach. And you notice verse 7, his method works. Because in verse 7, the assembly was divided. They began to argue. And again, notice, verse 8 tells us, the three things. No resurrection, no angel, no spirit. They believed this world was it. There was nothing outside this world. But then notice the Pharisees acknowledged them all. Then verse 9, they began to argue. And again, notice the Pharisees cried out, we find no wrong with this man. Now notice their response. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? They said, well, what if an angel or a spirit spoke this message to him? Therefore, this message must be true if he's heard it from a spirit or angel, because the Sadducees didn't believe in an angel. They would have to reject it. And so this is what they're trying to do. And verse 10, the argument gets so violent. Again, notice that the tribune has to come in and he has to take Paul away. He has to take Paul out by force. This is the interesting thing over and over here, is that Paul stirs these people up in such a way that the Roman guards have to step in and carry him out. You remember when they rioted in the temple, the guards basically carry him up the steps to where he stands to speak, and then they have to carry him out. Now they have to carry him out of this tribunal. And so Paul is maneuvering himself in such a way that he can accomplish his goals and can accomplish what needs to be done. Notice verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. And so here we have this vision from Paul that is a message he has been hinting around, that he has been getting, and in that he is being told, and there's some references in Acts and other books, that Paul knew he would have to go to Rome. And so here Jesus says that the time is here. You've done what you could. You stood in Jerusalem. Now it's time to go to Rome. And so this is what we're going to see the rest of the book of Acts is Paul getting to Rome. How does Paul get from Jerusalem to Rome, and what happens in getting there? So we continue in verse 11 to see how the Jews facilitate Paul getting to Rome. Notice verse 12, the next day, the Jews make a plan. They make an oath. This is another one of those interesting oaths that are one of those interesting statements in the book of Acts that makes you wonder how true these men were to their word. Notice verse 12, when it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. So there's 40 men who have made this oath, this bond, that they will not eat or drink until Paul has been killed, till Paul is put to death. And they make this plan, and they call out the chief priests and the elders, and this shows you how far they're willing to go to get Paul. They say, you go to the Roman tribune. You tell him that you want Paul to come to your court and be put on trial before you, that you want to have a meeting. And basically they say this is a setup. You're going to tell them, bring him to your courtroom. You're going to have this proceeding. And then when the Roman tribunal brings him down, they say, we are going to ambush them. We're going to ambush them, and we're going to kill Paul in the ambush. Now, again, I say this is how far they're willing to go to get Paul. Is the thing about this, if Paul's going down here, he's going to be guarded by Roman soldiers. They're going to have to deal with not only Paul, but also these Roman soldiers. That's why there's 40 of these men who make this oath. And that's why 40 are called, not just a few. They say, when he comes down, as he's walking through the streets, we're going to ambush him. We're going to have this point. We're going to ambush him, even if it costs us our own lives. And that's just how far these men were willing to take this oath, to know that because they're taking on the soldiers, there are some of these men who are most likely going to be killed or arrested. And if they're arrested, they're going to be tortured, and they could be executed for that, for killing a Roman soldier, but they're willing to do it to get rid of Paul. That's how much they want to get rid of Paul. Now, I say this is interesting because if you know the book of Acts, you know that this plan fails. And what's interesting is the question comes up, well, how much do these men keep this oath? Because from here, Paul's sent to Caesarea, and then he's going to be sent to Rome. These men, these faithful Jewish men that are here, they're faced with a decision. Do they break their oath and become an oath breaker and have that upon them? Or do they keep their oath and they starve themselves to death? Again, it's sort of interesting the position they're put in, but it's a sad reality of just how far they're willing to do Paul. And in their righteous behavior, they put themselves in an unwinnable situation. Now, what happens to save Paul is verse 16. Verse 16, if you want to call it, the providence of God steps in that the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush. And so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. So this is Paul's nephew. Paul's nephew enters. Now this is an interesting thing, is up till this point, we have not heard of Paul having a sister, nor have we heard a word about him having a nephew. And so that asks the question, I asked a few questions actually, of what's this relationship like? Was Paul's sister converted? Was she not? Why is she not mentioned? Why is her husband not mentioned? Why is this nephew? Again, the other thing about this is you got to think that we know Paul was in Tarsus and sent to Jerusalem. Apparently, at some time, his sister's the same way. Either she was sent to Jerusalem or she married an influential Jew who was in Jerusalem. And some think she possibly could have married an influential Jew. And if she did, then her son, this would explain how her son was able to overhear the plans of the ambush. And again, the next thing about this is we don't know how old this son is either. Again, some will point out, and typically when we see this and we teach this to our kids, most of the Bible stories we see, they picture this as a young teenage boy or so. But again, and the reason I do that is verse 17, excuse me, when Paul says, take this young man to the tribunal, or to the tribune. Now, the issue with that is what I've told you before. This definition of young man, or this word young man, can describe anybody who's 40 years or below. And so this has led some discussion of just how old his son, his nephew is. His nephew very well could be an older child, or an older man, meaning 20s or 30s, very similar to Paul in Acts chapter 8. You remember when they stoned Stephen, Paul is a young man who stands by as they stone Stephen. And remember, the young man was that he wasn't old enough to be on the council, but yet he was there at their meetings and he was there at their decision. They're listening to Stephen. And I think that lends credence into what happens here is that this nephew is in a spot Paul was in all those years ago, where he has a connection to this Jewish council. He's not on the council, but he has a close connection, so he knows their plans and he knows what's going to happen. But again, that's just my interpretation of connecting some dots. I don't know how he overhears this, how he knows it, but he hears about it. And so he tells Paul. Paul tells verse 17, the centurion, you take him and take him to the tribune. Verse 18, he calls the tribunal, and he asks the young man. Now notice verse 19, the tribune, this tells us a little bit about Paul, is that the tribune trusts Paul in that when the Roman guard brings this young man to Paul, he sends the guard out and he pulls the young man by himself, where it's just the young man and the tribune that are talking. That way no one can overhear. So that tells me that I think, and this may be part of the ambush, is that it makes me wonder, I shouldn't say, not know, but wonder about, if there wasn't a part of the Roman guard who may have been persuaded to allow this ambush to happen. And again, the Roman guard, the Roman soldiers, they had strict penalties, but they were also corrupt. If you paid them enough, they would do whatever you wanted them to do. And so I wonder if the tribune didn't have a feeling that I don't want these guards to overhear, so if there is a conspiracy, they're not going to circumvent this and let everybody else know. And so he calls him aside, verse 20, he tells him the plan. And again, you notice he says they're going to have you bring Paul down tomorrow. They're going to convince you that they're going to interrogate him. Verse 21, don't be persuaded, he said, because they're lying in ambush. And notice he tells them just how much. And again, he emphasizes to this Roman, they bound themselves to an oath. Now, this is key for the Jews, because the Jews, when they took an oath was binding. You didn't just break an oath. An oath was something very important. And so now he says that they're getting ready to send this to you. Verse 22, the tribune hears what this young man has to say. And again, notice the secrecy here. He tells him, you go and tell no one you have informed me of these things. He says, you go and don't tell anybody what you've told me. To me, again, it points to the idea that this tribune knew there was some corrupt people in his guard. There's people around that he was going to prevent them from finding them out and figuring out what they're going to do. Verse 23, the tribune, after hearing what Paul's enemies plan to do, he decides to send Paul out. Notice he calls two of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. So what he tells them is he says, get you some units ready, get your faithful men. And notice the size of the army here. He says you get 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 75 horsemen, 75 men on horseback. And you're going to protect Paul. You're going to get him out of here. And notice you're going to take him out at the 3rd hour of the night. Again, the Jewish calendar, day starts at 6 a.m., night starts at 6 p.m. So Luke gives us the Jewish reckoning of time. The Roman reckoning of time is ours, is midnight and noon. This is at 9 o'clock at night. He says, we're going to take Paul out. And again, it's because they're in Jerusalem that they use the Jewish time. Then he knows verse 27, he says, now also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix. And then you notice he begins to write this letter. And so he prepares this people. Now, notice what happens here in verse 26. He writes this letter to Felix. Felix is the governor who is over this. And we find out the tribune's name is Claudius Lysias. He says to His Excellency, the Governor Felix, greetings. Now remember, we talked about that. His Excellency is the same Greek word for most excellent Felix, which is connected to Acts 1, most excellent Theophilus, or Luke 1. He addresses Theophilus the same way as he does Felix here, leading that credence to possibly Theophilus being a Roman government official. Verse 27, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their laws, but charged him with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against me. Now, you'll notice a few things that Lysias does here. Lysias sort of fabricates the story a little bit, makes himself look good. What I mean by fabricate, because notice what he says. He says the Jews were about to kill him when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him. And he implies that he rescued Paul because he found out he was what? The Roman citizen. He doesn't know about Paul's a Roman citizen until well after the case. So he's trying to explain why he got involved in this situation in the first place. And he's trying to make it sound like he has done a good Roman guard duty. But then notice he says there's no charge. Again, you'll notice this throughout these chapters. There was a charge with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. He said there was no reason to keep him. There was nothing by Roman law that I should have kept Paul. He said, but I did because they wanted to kill him. He said, so now I'm sending him to you. And I told the Jews to come to you. Now, another reason they did this, and we'll get to this in a minute, is you got to remember he's coming to Felix. Felix is part of the Herod family. And he knows Jewish teaching. He knows Jewish law. So another reason he sends him to Felix is he's basically sending him, Felix, you know these people better than I do. You can figure out what's got them so hot under the collar. You can figure out their problem. And so you notice verse 31, the soldiers take their arms, they get their instructions. They took Paul, they take him to Antipatris. Basically what they do is, we're not sure exactly where this is, but they take him a couple miles outside the city. The 200 soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 75 horsemen, they march Paul out in the night, 9 o'clock at night. They get him out of the city. They get him away from the city where nobody can, the Jewish threat is over. And basically what happens, you notice, verse 32, the next day, the soldiers return to the barracks, but the horsemen go on. Those 75 horsemen, they ride and they continue on to Caesarea. And they take Paul. And so they come to Caesarea, they deliver the letter in Paul. Then you notice he begins to ask questions. Verse 34, Felix asks the question, where are you from? And he says he's from Cilicia. Then he said, I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And then notice, and he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So Felix takes him into custody, and Felix says, okay, I'll guard you. I'll listen to what they say. He said, but we got to wait till your accuser arrive. And again, notice the shift. And this is what's interesting about the end of Acts. When they realize Paul is a Roman citizen, we're not told he was put in prison, but he's put in the praetorium. Before this, he's placed in the barracks. He's under government control, but he's not put in a prison because he's not officially arrested and they have no charge against him. And a matter of fact, we're going to see as Felix holds him captive and keeps him there, we're never told that Felix puts him in a prison, but that he keeps him within the government complex, especially where the soldiers will be. Therefore, they can keep watch and protect him. And so that's getting us into Acts chapter 24. Any question about Acts 22 or 23? All right, we went about an hour. Let's take us about a 5 or 10 minute break, and then we'll look and see what happens before Felix, and we'll get into Festus. But get up and stretch for a few minutes and enjoy a break.